So a couple of weeks ago, I'd posted on social media, mostly Facebook, that I was considering starting a Patreon. I've decided to move forward with that. With what I'm seeing on social media, namely Facebook, is a massive amount of censorship and just the loss of content in the process, and them banning people, taking down people's accounts. And I really don't want to chance losing any more information. I'm very happy with Retic Eugenics and how that's worked out, but in the future I'm going to be using a membership-based platform for content. My Patreon is up. I don't recommend going to there and subscribing, since there is no content as of yet. It's going to be very cheap. I only have one tier for now. It's $5, and that'll be live streams, Patreon only updates, chat community, early access, exclusive content, some behind the scenes stuff, fan requests. But as far as the early access goes, it's an exclusive content. It's essentially going to be all exclusive content, because it's really going to be the only place I'm posting videos and information regarding reticulated pythons, some other, a few other species, in the legislation stuff. I do have a Flickr account where I do post some of my photography pics. I just haven't had the time to do it lately. So as far as the Retic goes, I'm going to be putting out quite a few videos, starting with their natural range, breaking it down into the different island groups within that range, showing the animals from those individual islands, then breaking it down further into the different dwarf localities and super dwarf localities, and just how many potential smaller locality retics there are, which nobody's really talking about or showing you, or discussing these, just how many hundreds and thousands of small islands there are throughout the reticulated python range that potentially have very small retics on them. So I'm also going to be doing videos on the actual breeding cycle that I don't see anybody discussing, the proper feeding, since everybody's being told to starve their snakes basically at this point, and also the use of polygenic traits for the improvement of the aesthetic value of morphs for these Estes and dwarf crosses. As a huge mistake that was made among mainlands captive reproduction throughout the last 20 years was the unnecessary gene stacking, with no consideration for the use of polygenic traits within certain localities to improve the aesthetic value of those animals. And as I'm seeing super dwarfs and dwarfs gain such demand for them, I'm seeing the same mistakes that we've made for the last 20 years being made in super dwarfs and dwarfs, and that is a gene stacking approach with no concern for the aesthetic aspect of it. When you're breeding for captive pets and breeders, they need to be of the highest aesthetic quality, and unfortunately a lot of dwarfs and super dwarfs have very limited color spectrum, and have very thin black. And when you start to layer multiple genes on top of a small color spectrum and thin black, they become more and more washed out, and they lose more and more contrast with each generation. So it is very important that we don't go down the same road with dwarfs and super dwarfs that we went down with mainlands, especially on the overproduction, because that's just not well, we've seen what happens. It crashes markets, and it results in a bunch of snakes ending up in the hands of people that shouldn't have them. So on top of all the retic information, I'm going to do some stuff with some white lips, some different scrubs. I do have some Peruvian red-tailed boas that I'd like to actually talk more about, since I never even mention them, and some Timor pythons. Also, reptile legislation is a big issue that nobody is getting the information that they are requesting. I see how frustrated people are when these bills pop up, and then when they pass and they have all these questions and they're very, very upset. And the typical response has been to yell about it on Facebook. I don't see anybody in the reptile industry providing answers and explanations for why these bills are being proposed and how they're passing. I used to do a lot of research on reptile legislation years ago. I backed off for a long time, but unfortunately I need to start doing that again, and people need credible information, and they need an honest explanation as to why. A good example recently was the tegu and green iguana issue in Florida, and everybody was very upset about that. But I didn't see any of the big name breeders or USARK explaining to anybody that this had all started before Trump was even in office. And I didn't see any push from the reptile industry 5-6 years ago to get ahead of this issue and get involved with Florida Fish and Wildlife and discuss with them possibilities to avoid what has happened, which was basically banning them for pets. And so far the approach is basically for the reptile industry just to be reactive, just to wait for things to get really bad and then get real upset and yell about it on the internet. That's not an effective approach to stopping legislation that the industry doesn't really find favorable. And it's not a long-term solution at all. You know, another aspect that I feel people were very misled about and not informed about, and had they been informed they would have acted differently, was the U.S. Large constrictor lawsuit, namely the second part of the lawsuit, which was the arbitrary and capricious listing. It was never explained to anybody how much more important that part of the lawsuit was than the interstate commerce part. The interstate commerce part was really insignificant because that can just be overturned with a simple amendment to the Lacey Act, which means we'll be right back to square one and the snakes will be illegal to ship across state lines again. Another aspect of that people weren't informed about was typically states want to be in line with whatever federal regulations are. So there isn't a disaster to try to figure out what's legal and what's not legal when a federal versus state conflict for animal transportation occurs. So we have seen a lot of states adopt whatever the language is on the federal level of the Lacey Act. So that's why we are up to 10 states now that you can't send retics to, and it's a Lacey Act violation. And a lot of people feel that this has been an attack on the reptile industry, which it is not. So I'm going to make videos talking to these people at these states and showing you the information they're giving me, so you can better understand that it's sometimes these quote-unquote attacks aren't attacks at all. They're just trying to simplify their state laws to be in accordance with federal laws. And most of these people probably had no idea it was going to impact reticulated pythons in any way. But that's not being explained to you. And these are some aspects of the reptile legislation that are being overlooked and creating a lot of frustration. And when I have tried to in the past explain this stuff, I've been met with some pretty harsh criticism. Most of my stuff gets censored, most of it gets taken down, and I usually get banned from whatever group I'm posting it in because I've been very critical of USARK's approach at this. So the only way I can really put out quality information without worrying about it being taken down and censored and it turning into a large argument is by putting it on Patreon, where the only people that are seeing it are the people that are paying $5 to be a part of the Patreon and are choosing to see it. So that's the only way left for me really to get out good information at this point regarding reptile legislation. So that's the other motivating factor in moving forward with Patreon. As far as the photography and maybe some product reviews, there's some book reviews I'd like to do that are a little kind of a side project. That's all things I'd really like to get into and do little videos on and show the equipment that I would recommend you use for for any kind of video or photography use. I'd like to eventually, hopefully, start a podcast if I can find the right people to be a part of it. I would like to have more science-based individuals. I really have no interest in supplying a platform for most of the breeders that are just excessively producing retics and are looking for an avenue to make a sale under the guise of producing quality information. I have no interest in having a podcast for people that want to tell you that a super dwarf's only going to get as big as a bull snake and a dwarf's only going to get as big as a boa. That's nonsense, and I have no interest in supplying the platform for that kind of misinformation. So if I can find enough people on the scientific side of things that would like to share what they're working on and their data, I will move forward with that. But until I can line up enough people, I can't do a podcast right away. But I would like to in the future to get as much quality information out there as possible. So we'll see if the Patreon thing takes off. If it works, it does. If it doesn't, that's fine too. But either way, as far as content that I'm producing, it's going to be strictly limited to Patreon. It just seems to be the way the internet is moving, and it's moving towards membership-based platforms. And the censorship on Facebook and Twitter just doesn't allow for open discussion anymore, which is very unfortunate. So, but I tried to make this very affordable at $5 a month, and you know, it's not going to be a Patreon where I'm asking for you to give me money to buy a new camera or to buy a snake or to buy this or that. I'm going to be supplying as much accurate information concerning specific issues as possible, and being as honest and open about it as possible without trying to sell you anything. Now, I might post a couple things for sale or some snakes, but it's not going to be strictly a way to move animals. So there does seem to be a demand for quality information, judging by how many questions I still get asked about retics and how many people I see asking questions on the internet. So we're going to give this a try and see how it goes, and hopefully it works out well.